America has seen clashes before, but never like this. The air inside the committee chamber was already tense. Humming with anticipation, cameras perched like watchful eyes, ready to catch every slip, every smirk, every flicker of weakness. Then came the moment. Levin leaned forward, voice sharp, words dripping with disdain. With a sneer that seemed rehearsed for maximum sting, spat out the insult. "Remind me again, where exactly did you get that law degree? Because it sure doesn't look like it's worth much." The sentence landed like a slap across the room. A sudden silence wrapped around the chamber. The staffers froze, pens hovering above notepads. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others glanced nervously at the cameras. Fully aware the nation was watching, Levin sat back with a smirk as if he had delivered the knockout punch. To him, it was entertainment, another jab in a long career of mocking, belittling, and ridiculing those who dared challenge his authority. His eyes darted toward the crowd, almost daring them to laugh along, to revel in his dismissal of Jasmine Crockett's hard-earned education, but they didn't. Instead, the silence thickened. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the quiet ripple of disbelief traveling across the chamber. On the back row, a young intern's mouth fell open, her eyes flicking between Levin and Crockett, waiting, almost begging for a response. Crockett sat perfectly still, no smirk, no flash of temper, just steady eyes fixed on Levin. The silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. She knew the cameras were rolling, knew every second of her reaction would be clipped, replayed, dissected across social media. The weight of every woman who had ever been talked over, every immigrant family who had ever been told their struggles didn't matter, every young student who had been mocked for daring to rise high-ret, all seemed to hang in the air. Between them, Levin mistook that silence for victory. He leaned back, satisfied, convinced he had stolen the stage. But he hadn't noticed the way the room had shifted, the way the audience had tilted ever so slightly toward her, waiting for something more, and something more was coming, because what happened next would leave even Levin's supporters in disbelief. Levin wasn't just another commentator. To his audience, he was a seasoned warrior of words, firebrand who built his career on volume, venom, and the art of tearing opponents to pieces. For decades, his booming radio voice and cutting TV appearances had earned him both loyal fans and bitter enemies. He thrived on the spectacle of confrontation. A man who believed dominance in debate was measured not by truth, but by how loudly you could mock someone into silence. And that's why his jab at Jasmine Crockett's law degree carried a special kind of sting. It wasn't just a cheap shot about education, a message to anyone watching: credentials don't matter if I say they don't. To Levin, expertise was negotiable, dignity was disposable, and power belonged to whoever could sneer the loudest. But across the table sat someone who represented everything he dismissed. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a freshman lawmaker finding her voice. She was a rising star in Congress already, carving out a reputation for her sharp mind, her tenacity, and her refusal to be bullied. Her law degree wasn't a prop, it was a testament to long nights, uphill battles, and the relentless pursuit of justice in a system designed to wear people down. That's why this moment mattered. It wasn't about two individuals exchanging insults. It was about the larger, simmering battle in America. Who gets to define credibility? Who gets to decide whose voice carries weight in the halls of power? For generations, the gatekeepers looked like Levin, loud, brash, dismissive men who could cut others down with a laugh line and walk away unchallenged. But Crockett represented a different America, one that refused to be talked over, one that carried the voices of immigrants, of women, of working-class families who demanded that preparation, dignity finally be respected. The cameras captured the contrast perfectly. Levin's smirk against Crockett's steady gaze, his arrogance against her composure, one playing to the crowd, the other holding something back, waiting, and the nation could feel it. This wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a test of what kind of leadership Americans were willing to applaud. Would they cheer for bluster, or would they finally honor substance? The stakes only rose as Levin pressed on. Emboldened by the silence, he chuckled, repeating the insult with fresh twists, needling her again and again, hoping to provoke anger. His words dripped with dismissal, a tone that said, "You don't belong here. You'll never belong here." He wanted the clip to go viral, but on his terms, another trophy of humiliation he could replay on his show to a chorus of laughter. But Crockett didn't give him that satisfaction. She didn't lash out. She didn't flinch. Instead, she let him keep digging, deeper and deeper, into the pit of his own arrogance. The longer he spoke, clearer it became that this wasn't just a fight for one woman's dignity, it was a fight. It's over the very idea of who deserves respect in America. And then, in that electric moment, when his words finally hung lifeless in the air, she knew the time had come, and when the insults kept coming, Crockett knew she had only one shot. To understand why Levin's insult cut so sharply, you have to understand the man behind it. Levin had spent decades cultivating his brand. the fiery commentator who never backed down, and the sharp-tongued legal mind who made a living out of belittling others. On the radio, on television, in books, his trademark was always the same mockery wrapped in legal jargon, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed his voice was the only one that mattered. From the very beginning of his career, Levin learned that spectacle sold. Facts could be argued, nuance could be debated, but nothing stuck like a sneer. If he could reduce his opponent to a punchline, he won not in the court of law, but in the court of public opinion. And in an age where clips traveled faster than context, that strategy paid dividends. One mocking phrase could turn into a headline, one dismissive laugh could ripple into a meme. For his base, it wasn't just about policy, it was about dominance. Again and again, Levin leaned into this persona. When opponents tried to challenge his arguments, he didn't meet them with equal weight, he drowned them out. He called them names, questioned their intelligence, and mocked their legitimacy. For years, that worked. His booming voice, his rapid-fire delivery, his habit of rolling his eyes or smirking at just the right time, it all created the image of a man untouchable, someone above the very people he mocked. But underneath the theater was something more dangerous. Arrogance so thick it clouded his judgment. Levin believed his experience gave him license to belittle anyone, no matter their credentials, no matter their story. He saw opponents not as equals in debate, but as props in his performance. And that arrogance often led him to underestimate those sitting across from him, time after time. He dismissed younger voices, women, and people of color who dared to enter the arena. He mocked their resumes, questioned their intelligence, and treated their presence as an inconvenience. To his audience, this was entertainment, the gladiator cutting down challengers. But to those watching more closely, it was bullying dressed up as bravado. It was a pattern visible across his career. When critics challenged him on contradictions, he doubled down with louder insults. When fact-checkers called him out, he brushed them off with contempt. The truth was secondary. What mattered was keeping the upper hand, keeping the smirk, keeping the performance alive. And for years, no one had really managed to crack that armor. That's why this moment with Jasmine Crockett was so pivotal. To Levin, mocking her law degree was routine. Just another line in a long playbook of dismissive tactics. He believed the crowd would laugh with him, that she would shrink back, that the silence would hand him victory. After all, it had worked so many times before, but arrogance has a way of blinding even the sharpest performers. Levin didn't see the room shift. He didn't sense that the silence wasn't agreement, it was discomfort. He didn't notice that his overconfidence wasn't landing as strength, it was starting to look like insecurity. What frustrated so many who watched wasn't just the insult itself, but what it represented: elitism, condescension, the idea that hard-earned success could be brushed off with a wave of the hand. It struck a nerve, not only for Crockett, but for every viewer who had ever worked twice as hard, only to be told it still wasn't enough. In that moment, Levin wasn't just mocking one degree, he was mocking the very idea of perseverance against the odds. And that's where his villainy truly crystallized, because arrogance on its own is irritating. But arrogance aimed at people who have clawed their way through struggle, that's infuriating. It triggered something deeper in the audience: frustration. With a system where the loudest voices often trampled the most deserving, Levin smirked, convinced he had the upper hand. But the truth was, he had overplayed it. The room wasn't leaning toward him anymore. The nation wasn't laughing with him, it was waiting, watching, hoping to see what would happen when arrogance finally met resistance. But against this arrogance stood someone whose life had been built on proving doubters wrong. Jasmine Crockett's presence in that room wasn't an accident. It was the product of years of struggle, sacrifice, and relentless determination. To understand why her silence carried such weight and why her clapback would carry even more, you have to go back to where it all began. Crockett grew up in a world where nothing was guaranteed. Raised in a working-class family, she learned early that dignity wasn't handed out freely. You had to fight for it. Her parents, though not wealthy, instilled in her the kind of values that no dollar could buy: respect, perseverance, and service to others. Around the dinner table, lessons weren't about privilege. They were about resilience. They taught her that doors rarely opened for people who looked like her, but that didn't mean she couldn't find a way to break them down. Those lessons carried her into the world of higher education, where she earned her law degree not by coasting, but by clawing through endless hours of study, working jobs to support herself, and often being one of the few women of color in the room. Each classroom carried its own unspoken test. Was she smart enough? Was she strong enough? Would she let the whispers of doubt silence her? Again and again, she answered with action. She graduated. She passed the bar. She stepped into a profession where the stakes were never abstract. They were people's lives in the courtroom. Crockett built a reputation not as someone chasing headlines, but as someone fighting for those most often overlooked. She defended clients who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys, stood up for families caught in the crosshairs of a justice system tilted against them, and carried herself with the weight of responsibility. To her, the law wasn't just a career, it was a calling. Every late night at her desk, every uphill battle in front of a skeptical judge, was fueled by a belief that justice had to mean something, even when the system said otherwise. But Crockett wasn't content to stop at the courtroom. She saw the patterns repeating in just laws written by disconnected leaders, communities neglected, voices ignored. So she made the leap into politics, running not as a polished insider, but as someone who had lived the very struggles her constituents faced. And it wasn't easy. She faced the familiar skepticism. Too young, too untested, too ambitious. She knocked on doors anyway. She listened. She learned. And slowly, she built a coalition of people who saw in her someone worth fighting for because she had always been fighting for them. That's how she rose. From the daughter of a working-class family to an elected voice in Congress, her journey wasn't smooth. It was marked by bruises, battles, and endless moments where the easier choice would have been to step back. But Crockett never stepped back. She leaned in, carrying the weight of every dismissal, every slight, every doubt, and turning it into fuel. Her values became her compass. Resilience, because she knew obstacles weren't stop signs, they were challenges to be met. Service, because she believed leadership wasn't about being seen, it was about lifting others. Community, because she never forgot where she came from. And she carried those voices with her into every chamber, every debate, every fight. That's what made her different from people like Levin, where he built his reputation on tearing others down. She built hers on lifting others up. Where his power came from volume, hers came from quiet persistence. And where he dismissed credentials with mockery, she embodied the truth that credentials meant struggle, sacrifice, and survival. In that committee room, every part of her journey sat silently beside her. Every time she had been doubted, every time she had been overlooked, every time she had been told to sit down, to quiet down, to be grateful for the scraps handed to her, that was the fire behind her calm gaze. She wasn't just holding her own dignity in that moment. She was holding the dignity of everyone who had ever been mocked for daring to rise. The audience didn't need her resume to feel it. They saw it in the way she held herself. They sensed it in the way she refused to flinch. They recognized it because so many of them had lived it. The struggle to prove yourself in a world eager to dismiss you, and that's why her eventual response would carry such force. Because it wouldn't just be words, it would be the culmination of a lifetime of defying expectations. It would be the answer of someone who had fought her way into the room, who refused to be laughed out of it. So when Levin tried to belittle her, Crockett's answer came from years of fire-tested resilience. The silence after Levin's first insult seemed to embolden him. He leaned forward again, his voice growing sharper, as if daring Jasmine Crockett to break. "A law degree doesn't make you qualified," he scoffed, his lips curling into that familiar smirk. "Plenty of people have paper on the wall, but clearly, that doesn't mean they know how to use it." The words cut like static through the room. Levin wasn't satisfied with one jab. He wanted to grind it in, to make sure the insult echoed beyond those four walls. His tone dripped with condescension, layered with the smug certainty of a man who had performed this act countless times before. He spoke not to Crockett, but to the audience, gesturing slightly toward the cameras, as if inviting them to join in his laughter. Across from him, Crockett sat perfectly still. Her eyes never left him. No raised voice, no interruption, just the quiet intensity of someone weighing every syllable that left his mouth. Those watching could sense it. She wasn't ignoring him. She was measuring him, allowing him to expose every ounce of his arrogance before she struck. Levin, misreading her composure as weakness, pressed harder. "You come in here flashing degrees and titles, but that doesn't change reality," he sneered. "This isn't about textbooks. This is about experience, about real knowledge. And frankly, Congress has seen more qualified interns." His chuckle rang hollow. But he delivered it anyway, convinced that he had landed a devastating blow. Around the chamber, reactions rippled. A staffer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A colleague raised her eyebrows, lips tightening in disapproval. Even some who typically aligned with Levin's rhetoric avoided eye contact, sensing he had crossed a line. But still, no one spoke. All eyes turned back to Crockett. She remained unmoved. The tension built with each passing second of her silence. It wasn't the silence of surrender, it was the silence of calculation, of someone letting their opponent exhaust themselves before the counterattack. And that silence began to work against Levin. The more he spoke, the more desperate he sounded. His words, once meant to humiliate, now hung heavy. Exposing the hollowness of his arguments, Crockett finally shifted slightly in her seat. A movement so small, yet so deliberate, it felt like a tremor before a quake. She took in a breath, her gaze steady, her voice still absent. The room leaned in. Even the cameras seemed to pause, waiting for what was about to happen. Levin wasn't watching closely enough to notice. He plowed on, doubling down one last time, his tone reaching a fever pitch. "So tell Tell us, he said, his grin widening. What good is that law degree of yours, when it clearly hasn't taught you how to handle someone like me? The arrogance in his question hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. The tension was unbearable now. Everyone in the room could feel it, the unmistakable sense that the silence was about to break, and when it did, it wouldn't just be a response, it would be a reckoning. Then, in a single sentence, she turned the entire room upside down. The silence snapped like a bowstring. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her eyes locked on Levin, her voice low but edged with steel. You mock my law degree, she began, her tone measured, every word crisp. But that degree has defended families who couldn't afford lawyers. It has fought in courtrooms you've never stepped into, and it represents years of sacrifice you wouldn't last a month enduring. The chamber froze. Levin's smirk flickered, just slightly, but enough to betray the first crack in his confidence. Crockett's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The power came from the precision, from the certainty that every sentence landed like a hammer against stone. She paused, letting the silence hang before delivering the next blow. You call yourself an expert because you shout the loudest, but shouting isn't law. Sneering isn't justice. And the last time I checked, the American people need leaders who can solve problems, not comedians auditioning for sound bites. Gasps rippled across the room. A murmur spread among the staffers, subtle at first, then swelling as heads turned, as pens scratched furiously against paper. Levin shifted in his chair, the smirk fading into a tight, uncomfortable line. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but Crockett didn't give him the chance. She leaned in closer, her voice rising just slightly enough to fill the chamber without ever tipping into anger. Let me remind you what that law degree means. It means I know what it's like to prepare case after case with people's lives on the line. It means I've had to prove myself in rooms full of people who doubted me before I said a single word. And it means when you try to erase my credibility, you're not insulting me or insulting every person who worked, sacrificed, and clawed their way toward an education they were told they'd never earn. The weight of her words pressed into the air. People weren't just listening, they were leaning forward, drawn in, waiting for the next strike. Levin tapped his pen against the desk, a nervous tick he hadn't shown before. His eyes darted toward the cameras, searching for control, but it was slipping from him, inch by inch. Crockett let the silence stretch again, then delivered the line that would echo across screens nationwide. So when you ask what good my law degree is, I'll tell you, it's good enough to silence you. The chamber erupted not in chaos, but in that sharp collective intake of breath that precedes history. A few gasps, a stifled laugh, the unmistakable sound of someone whispering wow under their breath. Even the cameras seemed to tremble, catching Levin as his face tightened, his jaw clenching against the weight of humiliation. For the first time, he looked small. The booming firebrand, the man who prided himself on always having the last word, was suddenly shrinking into his chair, his eyes darting away from Crockett's steady gaze. He tried to recover, fumbling for words, but nothing came out fast enough, nothing strong enough to counter the strike she had just landed. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply leaned back in her chair, composed as if she had done nothing more than state a fact. That composure only deepened the impact. The room knew what had just happened. Levin hadn't just lost the argument. He had been dismantled, stripped of his armor, undone by the very credentials he had mocked. The murmurs grew louder now. Staffers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling despite themselves. On the back row, a young aide who had winced at Levin's earlier insult now sat upright, eyes wide, as if she had just witnessed the turning of a tide. Levin cleared his throat, trying to steady himself, but his voice betrayed him. Well, if that's he stammered, the words clumsy, uncharacteristic. The man who had built a career on quick retorts suddenly couldn't find his footing, and the more he floundered, the more obvious it became. The power in the room had shifted. Crockett's silence now carried a different weight. Earlier, it had been the calm before the storm. Now, it was the calm after victory. She didn't need to pile on. She didn't need to humiliate him further. The contrast between her stillness and his unraveling spoke louder than any words could. And in that silence, the audience felt something deeper, a sense of vindication. This wasn't just about degrees or credentials. It was about dignity standing tall against arrogance, about composure triumphing over mockery. It was the answer so many had been waiting for. The moment when someone finally refused to let Levin's sneers define the stage, a staffer in the corner exhaled audibly, as though releasing tension that had been building for years. A ripple of quiet applause started, not loud enough to dominate, but real enough to break the barrier of decorum. Even those who had tried to stay neutral couldn't help it. They had seen the mask fall. Levin glanced toward the cameras again, but it was too late. The image had been captured, the clip already writing itself into political lore. The firebrand silenced, the rising star unshaken. He looked down at his notes, flipping a page for no reason, just to keep his hands moving. Crockett folded her hands, her face serene. She didn't need to say another word. Her point had been made, and in the chamber, in the silence, in the murmurs, in the stolen glances, everyone knew it. The battle was over. The outcome was undeniable. But the fallout wouldn't just stay in that room. It was about to explode nationwide. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her legendary clapback, the clip began racing across the internet like electricity surging through a live wire. Before the session even adjourned, phones were buzzing in pockets, and staffers were surreptitiously refreshing Twitter feeds. By the time Crockett walked out of the chamber, her words had already taken on a life of their own. "It's good enough to silence you." Within the hour, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Crockett clapback shot straight to #1, followed by hashtag silence by the law, and the brutally simple hashtag Levin owned. TikTok edits appeared almost instantly slow. Motion replays of Levin's tightening jaw set against dramatic soundtracks. Instagram Reels looped Crockett's delivery, paired with captions like, "When intelligence walks in, arrogance walks out." Twitter memes mashed up her one-liner with classic movie scenes. Levin cast as the villain who never saw the hero's punch coming. The press couldn't look away. Major outlets scrambled to slap headlines across their homepages. Congresswoman Crockett delivers viral mic drop against Levin. Law degree mocked. Response heard around the world. Is this the moment that redefined political debate? Cable news anchors replayed the exchange on a loop, dissecting each pause, every flicker of Levin's expression. Commentators on progressive networks praised it as a surgical strike and a reminder that facts, preparation, and dignity still win. Even conservative pundits, though less generous, couldn't ignore the optics. A firebrand who built his career mocking opponents had been left speechless by one perfectly timed rebuttal. Then came the celebrities. An Oscar-winning actress tweeted, "That's how you handle a bully poise and precision." A Grammy-nominated rapper reposted the clip with the caption, "Put this on repeat." A late-night comedian devoted an entire segment to mocking Levin's stammered response, ending with the punchline, "Some silences are louder than words." Levin's was deafening, but the real power didn't come from blue checks. It came from ordinary Americans who saw themselves in Crockett's fight. First-generation college graduates posted photos of their diplomas with the hashtag good enough. Immigrants told stories of working 2 jobs to pay tuition. Lawyers and teachers flooded timelines with messages like, "This is why we fight for education, because no one can take it away." The viral moment had struck a nerve deeper than politics. It was about respect, dignity, and the value of hard-earned expertise. International outlets picked up the story too. British newspapers described it as America's viral clapback of the year. Commentators in Canada and Australia marveled at how one exchange could dominate an entire political cycle. Even halfway around the world, Crockett's words resonated. The underestimated rising to silence the overconfident was a universal theme. Meanwhile, Levin found himself in uncharted territory. For decades, he had thrived on being the loudest voice in the room, but now the loudest moment of his career was silence his own. Memes mocked his stammer. Commentators replayed his smirk dissolving frame by frame. His allies tried to spin it as overblown, but their words were drowned out by the roar of the internet. The narrative had slipped out of his hands. For Crockett, it was transformation. Overnight, her social media following skyrocketed. Supporters hailed her as not just a congresswoman, but a symbol of preparation, of dignity under fire, of the ability to stare down arrogance without flinching. She became the embodiment of resilience, the reminder that grace under pressure still matters in a world addicted to noise. And America was watching, not just the political insiders, not just the cable news junkies, but students, workers, parents, and dreamers who saw their own struggles reflected in hers. In coffee shops, on subways, and classrooms, people replayed the clip and smiled, because in her victory, they felt their own, and from the rubble of this clash came a lesson bigger than politics. In the days that followed, as the headlines began to settle and the memes became part of internet history, something deeper emerged from Jasmine Crockett's clapback. It wasn't just the thrill of seeing a bully silenced, or the satisfaction of watching arrogance collapse under the weight of truth. It was the reminder of what that moment truly stood for. Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't traded insult for insult. She had chosen something far more powerful: dignity. In a chamber where mockery had long been mistaken for strength, her calm precision cut through louder than any sneer. What Levin tried to reduce to just a piece of paper became, in her hands, a symbol: the years of work, the late nights, the resilience of every person who has ever fought for their education despite the odds stacked against. Then that's why the moment resonated beyond politics. It wasn't about left versus right or red versus blue. It was about service versus arrogance, substance versus spectacle. It was about who gets to define expertise in Americond, Crockett's answer was simple. Expertise is earned through sacrifice, through service, through showing up again and again when others tell you that you don't belong. Her clapback wasn't petty revenge. It was a defense of every teacher dismissed for where they teach, every immigrant parent mocked for their accent, every young professional underestimated before they even open their mouth. It was a declaration that mockery doesn't erase truth, and sneers can't erase service. In that sense, Crockett's victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to the student pulling double shifts to pay tuition. It belonged to the worker laughed at for dreaming bigger. It belonged to anyone who has ever been told they're not enough, only to rise and prove otherwise. Because dignity, like arrogance, doesn't need to shout. It just stands steady until the noise around it crumbles. And that is why Crockett's words didn't just silence Levin, they uplifted millions who saw themselves in her resolve. This is the lesson. In a world that rewards volume, choose substance. In a culture that glorifies arrogance, cling to service. And when mockery comes end, it always comes remember that dignity, once spoken, can echo far louder than any insult. Her story becomes our reminder that your voice matters, that your work, your education, your resilience, none of it can be erased by someone else's sneer. And when the moment comes to stand, to speak, to defend yourself or those who can't, remember Jasmine Crockett. Remember that a single sentence, spoken with conviction, can shake the foundations of power. Which leaves us with one final question. Levin mocked her degree. He tried to strip it of meaning, to laugh away years of sacrifice with a single sneer. But Jasmine Crockett's words sharp.com/unshaken silenced everything. And in that silence, a truth rang louder than any insult. Dignity beats mockery. Preparation beats arrogance. Service beats spectacle. That's the story we witnessed here. Not just a clash of personalities, but a clash of values. One man clung to derision, the easy path of belittling others. One woman chose resilience, refusing to let her life's work be reduced to a punchline. And in that choice, she gave voice to millions who have faced the same dismissal, the same doubt, the same fight to be recognized. It's bigger than politics. It's about who we want to be as a people. Do we reward sneers or do we honor service? Do we measure strength by who shouts the loudest or by who carries themselves with dignity when it matters most? Crockett gave us the answer, and it's one we can all carry forward. So if this moment inspired you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel to keep these stories alive. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that their work, their struggle, their voice matters. And join this growing movement of people who believe in truth over noise, respect over ridicule, and dignity over arrogance. Because what happened in that chamber wasn't just history, it was a glimpse of the future we can build together. And that future begins with us. Now the question is, are you ready to stand with it?